What starts as a simple drive home turns into a nightmare when Alex Rivers is pulled over for no reason. As the situation escalates, Alex finds himself fighting not just for his own dignity, but for justice in a broken system. With mounting threats, a gripping trial, and a town on edge, Alex's story becomes the spark for real change. Will he succeed in reforming a system stacked against him? Subscribe and hit the notification bell to follow Alex's powerful journey and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in his place? It was a calm, cool evening in Cedar Grove, Ohio, as Alex Rivers steered his car down the mostly empty streets. The small suburban town was beginning to settle into its quiet night routine, with streetlights flickering on one by one as the last traces of sunlight disappeared from the sky. Alex, a 35-year-old African-American entrepreneur, felt the familiar comfort of routine as he drove home. It had been a long but productive day at work, and his body was tired, but it was the kind of tired that came with a sense of accomplishment. The smooth tones of jazz played softly through the car speakers, filling the space with a calming rhythm. The playlist was one that his wife, Laura, had created for him, a collection of their favorite songs to help ease the tension after long workdays. It had become part of his evening ritual, a way to unwind before stepping through the front door to embrace the noise and energy of family life. Alex glanced at his watch. 8:30 p.m. It was later than usual, but a last-minute meeting had run long, and now he was eager to get home. His kids, Emma and Jordan, would already be in their pajamas, likely waiting for him to read them their bedtime story. Emma, his precocious 8-year-old, loved to surprise him with her drawings from school, while Jordan, his 3-year-old son, was just starting to string sentences together, always eager to share his latest discoveries about the world around him. The thought of his family brought a smile to Alex's face. He had worked hard to build a good life for them. His tech startup, which had once been just a dream, was now thriving, and the success had allowed them to settle into this quiet, peaceful town. Life was stable, safe, even if it hadn't always felt that way. As a black man, Alex was no stranger to challenges. Growing up in a larger city, he had faced his share of discrimination and suspicion, often feeling like he had to prove himself just to be seen as equal. But here, in Cedar Grove, things had been different. Or at least, they had seemed different. He was well respected in the community, a local success story. People saw him as a businessman, a father, and a neighbor. But there was always that voice in the back of his mind, a quiet, nagging reminder of how fragile that peace could be. He had heard stories from other black men about being stopped by the police for no reason, about the subtle ways suspicion could creep in. Even in a place like Cedar Grove, Alex had never personally experienced it here, but the memory of past encounters lingered. He shook the thought away. Tonight wasn't the night to dwell on such things. He was almost home, and tomorrow would be another day of meetings and progress. For now, he would enjoy the quiet drive, the soothing jazz, and the anticipation of his children's faces lighting up when he walked through the door. As he turned onto the last stretch of road leading home, the streets became even more deserted, save for the occasional passing car. The orange glow of the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and Alex felt a sense of calm settle over him. It was moments like these that made all the hard work worth it. The stillness of the night, the certainty that he was heading back to everything that mattered most. The serenity of the evening was abruptly shattered by the shrill wail of a siren. Alex's heart skipped a beat as his rearview mirror lit up with the flashing red and blue lights of a police car. His mind raced, trying to figure out why he was being pulled over. He hadn't been speeding, he was sure of it. His car was in perfect condition, and he hadn't run any lights. His hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel as he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, his mind replaying every traffic law he might have accidentally broken. Nothing. He had done nothing wrong. But still, here he was, pulled over on an empty stretch of road with no one around to witness whatever was about to happen. The patrol car came to a stop behind him, its headlights glaring into his rearview mirror. Alex took a deep breath, trying to calm the unease that was slowly creeping into his chest. He had been through this before, just not here, not in Cedar Grove. He knew the drill. Keep your hands visible, stay polite, comply with all instructions. Don't give them any reason to escalate the situation. As the officer approached his car, Alex lowered the window, his movements slow and deliberate. The officer was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp and his expression hard. He didn't smile, didn't offer a friendly greeting. Instead, his eyes swept over Alex with a look of cold scrutiny. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone more commanding than polite. Alex handed over his documents, keeping his voice steady. "Evening, officer. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer didn't answer right away. He flipped through Alex's license and registration, his eyes lingering on the details before glancing back at him. "Where are you headed?" the officer asked, his tone implying suspicion that had no basis. Alex swallowed his frustration. "I'm on my way home. Just finished a long day at work." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's late for someone to be out driving around, don't you think?" Alex resisted the urge to sigh. "I had a meeting that ran long. Is there a problem, officer?" Instead of answering, the officer looked back toward the patrol car, where another officer stood, leaning against the door with his arms crossed. The second officer was younger, with a nervous energy about him. His hand rested near his holstered weapon, and though he wasn't actively threatening, his posture was enough to put Alex on edge. The first officer turned back to Alex, his eyes hardening. "Step out of the vehicle." A cold wave of anxiety swept through Alex. He had been polite. He had complied with all the instructions. There was no reason for this, but arguing wouldn't help. He knew that. "Of course," Alex said, keeping his tone calm as he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. The cool night air hit him as he stepped out of the car, standing beside it with his hands at his sides. The officer pointed toward the hood of the car. "Hands on the hood." Alex complied, placing his palms flat against the cold metal. His mind raced as the officer began patting him down, his movements rough and deliberate, as though he were expecting to find something. The second officer watched from a few feet away, his gaze flickering between Alex and his partner. "You been drinking tonight?" the officer asked as he continued the search. "No, sir," Alex replied evenly. "Just trying to get home." The officer's hands paused for a moment, then resumed the search, moving slower this time, as if trying to prolong the moment. Alex's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he kept it in check. Losing his temper wouldn't help. "You mind telling me why your taillights are so dirty?" the officer asked, his tone casual but accusatory. Alex frowned, caught off guard by the question. "It's been raining a lot lately. I haven't had a chance to wash the car." The officer didn't seem to care about the answer. He stepped back, looking Alex up and down with an expression that was difficult to read. "This your car?" the officer asked. "Yes, it's mine," Alex replied, keeping his voice steady. The officer's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest. "We'll see about that." Alex stood by the hood of his car, his muscles tense, as the officers circled around him. The street, once peaceful, now felt ominous in the stillness of the night. A couple of passing cars slowed down as drivers glanced over to see what was happening, but no one stopped. The first officer, whose name tag read Wilkins, motioned for the second officer, McNeil, to begin searching the car. Alex's heart sank as McNeil approached, a hesitant look on his face. It was clear that McNeil wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation, but he wasn't about to challenge Wilkins's authority. McNeil glanced at Alex, then opened the driver's side door and began rifling through the glove compartment, moving to the back seats after a few moments. Alex could feel his pulse quicken as his privacy was invaded, though he knew they wouldn't find anything. His car was clean. He hadn't done anything wrong. But that wasn't the point, was it? This wasn't about finding something illegal. It was about exerting control, about reminding Alex that no matter how successful he was, no matter how law-abiding, he could still be reduced to this, someone being searched for no reason on the side of the road. "You're awfully calm for someone in your situation," Wilkins said, his voice dripping with condescension. Alex met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I've done nothing wrong." Wilkins smirked, but there was no humor in it. "That's what they all say." McNeil finished searching the car and came back around, shaking his head at Wilkins. "Nothing." Wilkins' smirk faded, replaced by a look of annoyance. Alex could feel the tension building, the frustration simmering in the air. This wasn't going the way Wilkins had expected. He had wanted to find something, anything, that would justify this stop. But there was nothing. Alex could sense the shift in the mood. Wilkins wasn't going to let this end quietly. He couldn't. "Well, Mr. Rivers," Wilkins said, stepping closer, "you're free to go. But next time, I'd suggest making sure your taillights are clean." The dismissal was laced with disdain, as though Alex had somehow done something wrong simply by existing. Alex stared at him for a moment, considering his response. He wanted to say something, to call out the injustice of it all, but he knew better. The power dynamic here was clear, and it wasn't in his favor. So, instead, he nodded, his expression unreadable, and turned to get back into his car. As he sat behind the wheel and closed the door, he felt the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. The jazz that had once calmed him now felt hollow in the background, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. He started the car and pulled away, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, the red and blue lights disappearing into the distance. But the feeling lingered. The reminder that no matter how much success he achieved, no matter how much he tried to distance himself from the prejudices of the past, they would always find him. As Alex drove home, his mind raced with thoughts of the stop. He kept replaying the interaction in his head, analyzing every detail. He had been calm, compliant, respectful, everything he was supposed to be. And yet that hadn't stopped Officer Wilkins from treating him like a criminal, from searching him and his car without cause. It hadn't stopped the condescending tone, the thinly veiled disdain. Alex had spent his entire life working to prove that he was more than the stereotypes that had been placed on him. But in that moment, all of his accomplishments, all of his success, had been stripped away. He had been reduced to a suspect, and there was nothing he could do about it. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the house was dark. Laura had probably put the kids to bed by now, and part of him was relieved that they hadn't been awake to see his frustration. He needed a moment to himself, a moment to process everything that had just happened. He sat in the car for a few minutes, staring out at the house, the warm glow of the porch light contrasting with the coldness that still clung to him from the encounter. Eventually, he turned off the car and stepped out, the sound of his footsteps on the gravel louder than usual in the stillness of the night. Inside, the house was quiet. Laura was sitting on the couch, reading a book. When she saw him, she smiled softly and stood up, walking over to him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head on his chest. "You're late," she said, her voice gentle. "Long day?" Alex hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, long day." She looked up at him, her expression concerned. "Everything okay?" He didn't answer right away, unsure of how to explain what had just happened. Finally, he sighed. "I got pulled over on the way home." Laura's face tensed, and she pulled back slightly. "What? Why?" Alex shrugged. "No reason. They said my taillights were dirty." Laura's eyes darkened with anger. "Alex? I know," he said quickly, cutting her off. "But it's over now. I'm fine. Just tired." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, we'll talk about it tomorrow." Alex kissed her forehead and went upstairs to check on the kids. Emma and Jordan were both fast asleep, their faces peaceful in the soft glow of their nightlights. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them, feeling the weight of the night settle deeper into his bones. He had been through this before. He would get through it again. But this time, something felt different. This time, he couldn't just let it go. The following morning, Alex woke up feeling the lingering weight of the previous night's events pressing down on him. The house was still quiet, the soft early light filtering through the curtains. He lay in bed for a few moments, trying to push the memories of Officer Wilkins and the search from his mind, but they clung to him stubbornly. Every moment of that encounter was still sharp, each look and word reverberating through him. Laura stirred beside him, opening her eyes and immediately reaching out to touch his arm. "Morning," she whispered. "How are you feeling?" Alex sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't know. Still trying to shake it off, I guess." She sat up, her eyes full of concern. "Do you want to talk about it?" He considered the offer for a moment before nodding. He didn't usually like to dwell on these things, but the look in Laura's eyes told him she wouldn't let it go. He needed to talk it out, if only to try to make sense of it himself. "I don't get it, Laura," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was polite. I followed all the rules. And they still treated me like I didn't belong." Laura's jaw tightened, and she looked away for a moment before responding. "You do belong, Alex. You've worked hard for everything we have, for this life we've built. Don't let them take that away from you." Alex appreciated her words, but he couldn't help the gnawing feeling that maybe she was wrong. Maybe it didn't matter how hard he worked, how much he succeeded. Maybe to people like Officer Wilkins, he would always be someone to suspect, someone who didn't quite fit. "I know," he said softly, "but it feels like no matter how much I do, no matter how much I prove myself, I'll always be seen as less." Laura reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "That's not true. You're not less. And this, what happened last night, that's on them, not you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words hanging between them. Finally, Alex took a deep breath and nodded. "You're right. I know you're right." Laura leaned in and kissed his cheek, her touch a small comfort against the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. "We always do." Later that day, Alex found himself staring at his phone, contemplating what to do next. The encounter with the officers had shaken him, but more than that, it had ignited something inside him, a feeling that this wasn't something he could just let go this time. He had been through too much in his life to let another instance of unjust treatment slide without consequence. His children, Emma and Jordan, were growing up in this world, and he wanted them to inherit a future where this kind of treatment wasn't just accepted as part of their reality, but he didn't know where to start. Should he report it? Should he go to the media? Was it even worth pursuing? Part of him wanted to forget the whole thing, to move on. But another part, the stronger part, was telling him that this could be the moment to stand up and push back. Just as he was lost in thought, his phone buzzed, pulling him out of his reverie. The name on the screen surprised him. Captain Logan Shaw. He recognized the name. Shaw was the captain of the Cedar Grove Police Department. They hadn't met, but Alex had heard good things about him around town. He was known for being a no-nonsense officer, someone who cared about community relationships. Hesitating for only a second, Alex swiped to answer the call. "This is Alex Rivers." "Mr. Rivers, this is Captain Shaw with the Cedar Grove Police Department." The voice on the other end was deep, steady, and professional. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "No, not at all," Alex replied, sitting up straighter. "How can I help you?" "I've been made aware of an incident that occurred last night," Shaw said, his tone neutral but carrying a weight of importance. "Officers Wilkins and McNeil pulled you over, correct?" Alex's pulse quickened. So the department was aware of what happened. He had expected them to sweep it under the rug, to ignore it like so many other incidents. But here was Shaw, reaching out to him directly. "Yes, that's correct," Alex answered. It was a rough experience." "I'm sure it was," Shaw responded, a note of sympathy creeping into his voice. "I wanted to personally reach out to you because I've reviewed the preliminary report, and frankly, I have concerns about the conduct of my officers. I'd like to meet with you in person if you're open to it, to discuss what happened in more detail." Alex wasn't sure how to feel. On one hand, he was relieved that Shaw seemed to be taking the incident seriously. On the other hand, he wondered if this was just damage control. Was Shaw trying to smooth things over before they got out of hand? "I appreciate that, Captain," Alex said cautiously. "I'll admit, I wasn't expecting anyone from the department to reach out." Shaw chuckled, though it was devoid of humor. "I understand. Trust in law enforcement isn't exactly at an all-time high right now. But I take these matters seriously, Mr. Rivers. If my officers acted inappropriately, I want to address it." Alex paused, considering the offer. Meeting with Shaw could be a step in the right direction, but it could also be a way for the department to placate him without real accountability. Still, this was more than he had expected, and maybe it was a chance to make sure his voice was heard. "Okay," Alex said finally. "Let's meet." "Great," Shaw replied. "Can you come down to the station tomorrow morning?" "I'll be there," Alex agreed, feeling a mixture of apprehension and determination. Tomorrow, he would make sure Captain Shaw understood exactly what had happened. And maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something bigger. The next morning, Alex pulled into the parking lot of the Cedar Grove Police Department, his mind buzzing with nerves. The building was an imposing structure, its gray stone exterior reflecting the seriousness of its purpose. Alex sat in his car for a moment, taking a few deep breaths, before finally stepping out and walking toward the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet but tense. Officers moved through the halls, some glancing at Alex as he passed. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, wondering who he was, why he was there. He was a stranger in their world, and they knew it. A receptionist directed him to Captain Shaw's office, and within minutes, Alex found himself seated across from the captain, the man's sharp blue eyes studying him carefully. "Mr. Rivers, thank you for coming in," Shaw said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, but not overly so, a gesture of respect, not intimidation. "Thank you for reaching out," Alex replied, trying to read Shaw's expression. The captain's face was calm, professional, but there was an intensity in his gaze that suggested he took this meeting seriously. Shaw leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. "I'm not going to waste your time, Mr. Rivers. I've reviewed the report from Officers Wilkins and McNeil, and I have some serious concerns about their actions that night. I'd like to hear your account of what happened, in your own words." Alex appreciated the directness. He took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the previous night, the sirens, the rough search, the condescending remarks. As he spoke, Shaw remained silent, listening carefully, his expression unreadable. But there was something in the way Shaw nodded slightly at certain points that told Alex the captain wasn't surprised by what he was hearing. When Alex finished, Shaw sat quietly for a moment, as if processing everything. Then he spoke. "It sounds like you were treated with a level of suspicion that wasn't warranted. I've seen the footage from your dash cam, and I have to agree with you. This was not handled appropriately." Alex blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected such an open admission from Shaw. "So, what happens now?" Shaw leaned forward, his voice firm but calm. "I've already placed Officers Wilkins and McNeil under internal review. There's going to be an investigation into their conduct, and if they're found to have violated department protocols, they'll be disciplined." Alex nodded, relieved that something was being done. But a nagging doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Would discipline really be enough? Would it stop officers like Wilkins from treating people like him this way in the future? Shaw seemed to sense Alex's hesitation. "I know that an internal review may not seem like enough, Mr. Rivers, and I understand if you're skeptical, but I want you to know that I take this very seriously. Cedar Grove is a small town, but that doesn't mean we're immune to the issues larger cities are facing. We need to build trust with the community, and that starts with holding ourselves accountable." Alex studied Shaw for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. The captain seemed genuine, but Alex had been disappointed by the system before. He had seen how promises of change could turn out to be little more than lip service. "Thank you for taking this seriously, Captain," Alex said cautiously. "But what about the bigger picture? What happens to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else?" Shaw leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. You're not the first person to bring this up. We need systemic change, not just individual accountability." Alex felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Shaw was different. Maybe he wasn't just saying what Alex wanted to hear. "I'm working on proposals for department-wide reforms," Shaw continued. "Bias training, more community outreach, better oversight. But change like that takes time, and I need support from the community to make it happen." Alex nodded slowly. "What can I do to help?" Shaw smiled faintly. "Be vocal, Keep the pressure on. The more people demand change, the harder it is for the system to ignore it. For the first time since the incident, Alex felt like he had some control over what would happen next. He wasn't just a victim of the system. He could be a part of changing it. "Okay," Alex said, his voice steady. "Let's make it happen." The days following Alex's meeting with Captain Shaw were a whirlwind. News of the traffic stop had spread quickly, thanks to social media. The dashcam footage, which had been quietly circulating among friends and family, was picked up by a local news station after Laura convinced Alex to share it publicly. The video, clear and irrefutable, showed the moments of the stop, the rough handling, and the unnecessary search. Within hours, it had gone viral. What started as local outrage quickly ballooned into something much larger. People from all over the country were commenting on the video, sharing their own stories of similar experiences. Hashtags like #hashdriving, while black, and #police accountability trended across social media platforms, and soon, national news outlets were picking up the story. At first, Alex wasn't sure how to handle the sudden attention. His phone buzzed nonstop with interview requests, offers of support from civil rights organizations, and messages from people thanking him for speaking out. It was overwhelming. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, but now it seemed like there was no turning back. Laura, ever the steady presence, urged him to take control of the narrative. "This is bigger than just us, Alex," she said one evening as they sat together in their living room. "People are looking to you now. You have a chance to really make a difference." Alex stared at his phone, still buzzing with notifications. "But what if I mess it up? I'm not an activist, Laura. I don't know how to navigate all of this." "You don't have to be an activist to speak the truth," she replied gently. "Just tell your story. Be honest. That's enough." Taking her advice to heart, Alex decided to accept a few interview requests. The first was with a local news station, a short, straightforward segment where he recounted the events of the traffic stop. The second was with a national outlet, a longer interview that delved into the broader issues of racial profiling and systemic bias in policing. As Alex's face and story became more widely known, the public response grew even stronger. Protests began to form outside the Cedar Grove Police Department, with signs demanding justice and reform. The footage of the traffic stop was projected on buildings during rallies, and activists called for immediate changes to the town's policing policies. Captain Shaw, true to his word, issued a public statement acknowledging the department's shortcomings and pledging to take corrective action. He reiterated the need for systemic change, promising to implement reforms that would address bias and improve accountability. But for many, words weren't enough. The community wanted to see real, tangible results. Amid the growing movement, Alex found himself at the center of it all. He was no longer just a man who had been wronged by a couple of officers. He had become a symbol of the fight for justice, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. But with that newfound visibility came a new set of challenges. Alex began receiving threats, anonymous emails and messages warning him to back down, to stop stirring the pot. Some were vague and menacing, others more explicit, threatening harm to him and his family. The first time he saw one of these messages, his blood ran cold. "What do we do?" Laura asked, her voice tight with fear after reading one particularly threatening email. "Do we go to the police?" Alex hesitated. The idea of turning to the police for help felt strange, considering everything that had happened. But Shaw had been supportive so far, and maybe this was the kind of thing the captain would take seriously. "I'll talk to Captain Shaw," Alex said finally, "but we can't let this scare us into silence." "That's what they want." Laura nodded, though her expression remained tense. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Alex assured her, though the weight of the situation was beginning to press down on him. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Protests grew larger, and the calls for reform louder. The media attention didn't die down. Instead, it intensified, with more and more people looking to Alex for guidance on the next steps in the fight for justice. But along with the growing support came more threats, more attempts to intimidate him into backing down. Despite the fear and uncertainty, Alex knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. This fight was bigger than him, bigger than Cedar Grove. It was a fight for justice, and it was one he was ready to see through to the end. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft streaks of light across Alex's bedroom. But the warmth did little to thaw the chill that had settled over him. His phone sat on the bedside table, buzzing incessantly with notifications. Each buzz carried the weight of the world, another news update, another message of support, and, increasingly, another threat. Since the release of the dashcam footage, Alex had become a household name. His story had sparked national attention, turning him into an unexpected figure in the growing movement for police reform. But not all the attention was positive. Anonymous emails, social media posts, and even letters had started flooding in, filled with anger, hate, and threats. One particular message from the night before still lingered in his mind. It had been different from the others. More specific, more chilling. "We know where your kids go to school. Back off, or you'll regret it." The moment he had read it, a cold sweat had broken out across his body. It wasn't just an idle threat. Someone had taken the time to dig into his life, to find out personal details, and that realization sent a wave of fear through him that he couldn't shake. He had immediately forwarded the message to Harper Quinn, his lawyer, who had advised him to notify Captain Shaw. But Alex had hesitated. After everything that had happened, how could he trust the police to protect him? Laura came into the bedroom, her face tight with concern as she watched him staring at his phone. "Another one?" Alex nodded, rubbing his face with both hands. "It's getting worse, Laura. They know about the kids. They know where they go to school." Her expression shifted from concern to fear in an instant. "What? Alex, that's serious. We need to do something. We can't just ignore this." "I know," Alex said, his voice weary. "I'm going to call Captain Shaw. See what he says." Laura sat beside him on the bed, her hand resting on his arm. "Do you think he'll actually do something?" Alex hesitated before answering. "He's been supportive so far. I hope he'll take this seriously." Taking a deep breath, Alex picked up his phone and dialed Captain Shaw's number. The phone rang twice before Shaw answered, his voice steady and calm as always. "Mr. Rivers, good morning. What can I do for you?" "Captain, I'm afraid things have escalated," Alex began, keeping his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "I've been receiving threats, serious ones. Last night, someone sent me a message saying they knew where my kids go to school. This isn't just some anonymous internet troll anymore. It feels dangerous." Shaw's tone shifted immediately, his voice growing more serious. "That's not something we take lightly, Mr. Rivers. I'm going to get my team involved. We'll increase patrols around your house and the school, and I'll assign an officer to monitor your family's safety. But I also need you to share any and all threats you've received with me. We need to build a case." Alex's initial relief at Shaw's quick response was tempered by a lingering doubt. It wasn't that he didn't believe Shaw was trying to help. He did. But could a system that had failed so many others truly be trusted to protect him now? "Okay," Alex said slowly. "I'll forward you everything. I appreciate you taking this seriously." "I always take threats seriously," Shaw replied. "And you should too. We'll do everything we can to keep you and your family safe. But be cautious. These kinds of threats can escalate quickly." After hanging up, Alex forwarded the emails and messages to Shaw, hoping that the police would be able to do something before it was too late. But the unease gnawed at him. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, never wanted to be at the center of a movement. And now his family was at risk because of it. He looked over at Laura, who was staring at him, her face etched with worry. "It'll be okay," he said, trying to reassure her, even though he wasn't entirely sure of it himself. "Shaw's on it. They're going to make sure we're safe." Laura nodded, but the tension in her posture didn't ease. I don't want the kids to get caught up in this. They're too young to understand what's going on." Alex's chest tightened with guilt. He had never wanted this fight to spill over into his family's life, but now it had. And no matter how hard he tried, there was no escaping the reality that they were all in danger because of him. The threats didn't stop. If anything, they increased. And with each new message, Alex felt the walls closing in a little more. The pressure was relentless, and though Captain Shaw had followed through on his promise to increase patrols around their home and the school, it wasn't enough to quiet the fear gnawing at Alex's gut. He began avoiding public appearances, pulling back from the media storm that had enveloped him. Invitations to speak at rallies and events poured in, but Alex found himself declining more and more of them. He told himself it was for his family's safety, that staying out of the spotlight would reduce the risk, but the truth was more complicated. The fight was wearing him down, and the emotional toll was becoming too much to bear. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Alex sat on the back porch, staring up at the stars. The night was calm, but the peace of it felt deceptive. His mind was anything but calm. The weight of everything, his responsibility, the expectations of the community, the constant threats, pressed down on him like a physical force. Laura joined him on the porch, sitting beside him in silence for a few minutes before she finally spoke. "You've been quiet lately. What's going on?" Alex didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how to put his feelings into words. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Laura. I thought I could handle it, but now, I don't know. It's like every time I try to take a step forward, something else happens to push me back." Laura looked at him, her eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to do it alone, Alex. I'm here. We're in this together." "I know," Alex said softly, "but it feels like I'm dragging you and the kids into something dangerous. I never wanted that. I never wanted to put you in harm's way." "You didn't put us here," Laura replied firmly. "This fight was going to happen with or without you. But you standing up for yourself, standing up for what's right, that's something to be proud of. It's not easy, but it matters." Alex closed his eyes, trying to hold on to her words, but the exhaustion inside him was overwhelming. I don't know if I can be the face of this movement anymore, Laura. I'm not an activist. I didn't ask for any of this." "No, you didn't," Laura agreed. "But you're here now, and you're making a difference. Look at how many people are rallying behind you, how many people are speaking out because you did. You've given them hope, Alex." He opened his eyes and looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. He had sparked something bigger than himself, something that mattered. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. "What if something happens to you or the kids?" Alex asked, his voice raw. "What if this all goes wrong?" Laura took his hand, squeezing it gently. "We're going to be okay. I believe that, and I believe in you." For the first time in days, Alex felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. Laura's faith in him, her steady presence, gave him the strength he needed to push through the fear. The following day, just as Alex was beginning to feel like he couldn't carry the weight of the movement any longer, he received a call from Captain Shaw. "Mr. Rivers, I've been working on something that I think you'll want to hear about," Shaw said, his voice steady and calm, but carrying a sense of urgency. "What is it?" Alex asked, curiosity piqued. "I've been talking to the mayor and some other city officials about implementing some real changes in the department. I know you've been pushing for reform, and I think we might be able to get something significant done if we work together." Alex's heart skipped a beat. This was what he had been hoping for. Real, systemic change, not just hollow promises. But there was still a part of him that was cautious. That wondered if this was just another attempt to placate him without addressing the deeper issues. "What kind of changes are we talking about?" Alex asked, trying to keep his voice level. "We're talking about bias training for all officers, stronger oversight mechanisms, and community involvement in policing decisions," Shaw replied. "It's not going to fix everything overnight, but it's a start." Alex sat back, processing Shaw's words. It sounded too good to be true, but he had to admit that Shaw had been supportive throughout the entire ordeal. Maybe this was his chance to help bring about the changes he had been fighting for. "I want to be involved in this process," Alex said firmly. "If we're going to make real change, I want to make sure the community's voice is heard." "That's exactly why I called you," Shaw replied. "I don't want this to be just another top-down initiative. We need community leaders like you to help shape these reforms." The weight on Alex's shoulders lightened just a little. For the first time in weeks, he felt like there was a way forward. like there was a path to real progress. Shaw's offer was a lifeline, a chance to turn the pain and frustration of the past few months into something constructive. "I'm in," Alex said, his voice filled with determination. "Let's make it happen." The day of the trial arrived like an ominous cloud hanging over Cedar Grove. The courthouse was packed with reporters, spectators, and community members. Everyone had come to witness the culmination of a case that had shaken their small town to its core. The tension in the air was palpable. No one knew how this would end, but everyone knew that the verdict would have far-reaching consequences. Not just for Alex Rivers, but for the entire community. Alex sat at the plaintiff's table, his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced over at Harper Quinn, his attorney. Harper had been his steadfast ally throughout the ordeal. And now, as they prepared for the trial to begin, she gave him a reassuring nod. "You're ready for this, Alex," she whispered, her voice firm but soothing. "We've got the evidence. The truth is on our side." Alex took a deep breath and nodded, but the nerves didn't fade. His mind raced with thoughts of everything that had led to this moment. The night he had been pulled over, the threats that had followed, the protests, the media frenzy. It all came down to this. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his family, for his community, for all the people who had experienced the same kind of injustice he had faced. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and the judge entered, taking his place behind the bench. The room fell into a hush, everyone turning their attention to the front as the trial began. The prosecution's case hinged on the dashcam footage, which showed the officers, Tom Wilkins and Jerry McNeil, stopping Alex without cause, subjecting him to an unjust search, and making racially charged remarks. The footage had gone viral and was the linchpin of Alex's case. Harper had built a strong argument around it, pointing to the officers' conduct as clear evidence of racial profiling and abuse of power. As Harper presented the footage to the jury, the room was silent, the weight of the evidence hanging over everyone. The video showed the moment Alex was pulled over, the rough treatment he had endured, and the thinly veiled contempt in the officers' voices. It was hard to watch, even for Alex, who had lived it. Seeing it play out on the screen in front of him brought back the anger and humiliation he had tried so hard to bury. When the footage ended, Harper stood and addressed the jury. "What you've just seen is not an isolated incident. It's part of a broader pattern, a pattern of discrimination and abuse that too many people in our community have experienced. Mr. Rivers was pulled over and treated like a criminal, not because of anything he did, but because of the color of his skin. That's not justice. That's not what our legal system stands for." The jury members shifted in their seats, their expressions serious as they absorbed Harper's words. Alex could feel the tide turning in his favor, but he knew the defense would fight back with everything they had. The defense attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Lawrence Burns, stood next, trying to paint a different picture. He argued that the officers had been following standard procedure, that they had reasonable suspicion to stop Alex, and that there was no evidence of racial bias. He tried to discredit the dashcam footage, suggesting that it didn't tell the whole story, that Alex's calm demeanor could have been calculated to provoke the officers. Alex's jaw tightened as he listened to Burns' arguments. It was clear the defense was grasping at straws, trying to twist the narrative, but it still stung. The idea that he was somehow to blame for what had happened, that he had provoked the officers simply by existing, cut deep. When Harper had the opportunity to cross-examine the officers, she didn't hold back. She questioned Wilkins and McNeil about their actions that night, forcing them to confront the inconsistencies in their reports. Wilkins, in particular, struggled to explain why he had searched Alex's car without cause, his answers becoming more defensive and evasive as Harper pressed him. The tension in the courtroom reached a boiling point when Harper asked the officers directly, "Did you stop Mr. Rivers because he's black?" Wilkins shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushed. "No," he muttered, his voice strained. "That's not why." Harper didn't flinch. "Then why did you stop him? What made you think he was suspicious?" Wilkins hesitated, his eyes darting toward Burns for support. "It was late. His car, but But there was nothing illegal about his car, was there? Harper pressed. He wasn't speeding, his lights weren't out, and yet you treated him like a suspect. You searched him without cause. You made comments about his race. You treated him differently because of who he is. Isn't that right? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Everyone was waiting for Wilkins to answer, but the officer remained silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes downcast. He knew, as everyone in the room did, that there was no defense for what he had done. When the defense rested its case, it was clear that the jury had seen through their arguments. The dashcam footage and the officer's evasive testimony had done the damage, and as the trial drew to a close, Harper delivered a powerful closing argument. "This case isn't just about Mr. Rivers," Harper said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "It's about all the people who have been stopped, searched, and treated like criminals because of the color of their skin. It's about holding those in power accountable for their actions. It's about justice." The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courthouse growing with each passing minute. Alex sat in the hallway with Laura, Harper, and Captain Shaw, his nerves frayed as he waited for the verdict. He had fought so hard to get to this point, but now all he could do was wait. Finally, the jury returned to the courtroom, and everyone took their seats. The forepersons stood, holding the verdict in their hands. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. In the case of Rivers versus Officers Wilkins and McNeil, we find the defendants guilty of misconduct and violation of civil rights. The words hit Alex like a wave of relief. He exhaled deeply, his body sagging in his seat as the weight of the past months lifted from his shoulders. The officers had been held accountable. Justice had been served. Beside him, Laura squeezed his hand, tears of relief in her eyes. Harper leaned over and whispered, "We did it, Alex." Captain Shaw gave him a respectful nod. "This is just the beginning." As the courtroom began to clear, Alex stayed in his seat for a moment, taking it all in. He had won the case, but the fight wasn't over. The verdict was a victory, but it was just one step in the larger battle for justice. In the days that followed the trial, Alex's life shifted dramatically. The verdict had made headlines across the country, and the victory was hailed as a major win for the movement toward police reform. Civil rights organizations praised Alex for his courage and determination, and the public's response was overwhelmingly positive. But as the dust settled, Alex found himself feeling both relieved and overwhelmed. The pressure he had felt before the trial had eased, but a new kind of responsibility had emerged. People were looking to him for leadership, for guidance on what came next. The fight for justice wasn't over. It had just begun. Captain Shaw wasted no time in following through on his promise to push for reform. The police department implemented mandatory bias training for all officers, and new oversight mechanisms were put in place to ensure greater accountability. A community review board was established, and Alex was invited to join as a key member. It was a significant step forward, but Alex knew there was still much more to be done. One evening, as Alex sat at the kitchen table with Laura, going over the latest developments in the reform efforts, she looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "You've come a long way, Alex," she said softly. "Do you ever stop to think about that?" Alex smiled, though there was a weariness in his eyes. "I think about it every day, but there's still so much work to do." Laura nodded. "I know, but you've made a real difference. Not just for us, but for the whole community." Alex looked down at the stack of papers in front of him. Proposals for further reforms, community outreach initiatives, reports on the progress that had been made. He had never imagined himself in this position, but now that he was here, he couldn't imagine turning back. "I just want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else," he said quietly. "I want to make sure that people are treated with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are." Laura reached across the table and took his hand. "You're doing that, Alex. You're changing things." As the evening wore on, Alex thought about how far he had come since that night on the side of the road. He had faced injustice head-on, and though the fight had taken its toll, he had emerged stronger for it. The journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. He wasn't the same man he had been before, and the world around him wasn't the same either. Months after the trial, Cedar Grove had begun to transform. The police department was no longer the impenetrable institution it had once been. The community had a voice in policing decisions, and officers were held to a higher standard of accountability. Trust, though fragile, was being rebuilt. Alex stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out at the crowd that had gathered for a community town hall meeting. The energy in the air was hopeful but cautious. People were excited about the changes that had been implemented, but they knew the fight for justice was far from over. As Alex stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell silent, their eyes on him, waiting to hear what he had to say. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice strong and steady. "We've come a long way, but our journey isn't over," Alex said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "This fight isn't about one case or one victory. It's about building a system that works for everyone, a system that treats all people with dignity and respect." The crowd erupted in applause, and Alex felt a surge of emotion swell in his chest. He had never asked to be a leader, but now that he was here, he understood the weight of his responsibility. This was about more than just him. This was about creating a better world for his children, for future generations. After the town hall, as Alex walked through the crowd, he was approached by a young man who had been at the forefront of the protests. The man extended his hand, his eyes filled with admiration. "Thank you for everything you've done, Mr. Rivers," he said. "You've inspired a lot of us." Alex shook the man's hand, feeling a deep sense of pride. "Thank you. But this is just the beginning. We all have to keep pushing." As the sun began to set over Cedar Grove, casting a golden glow over the town, Alex felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight for justice would continue, but he knew that he wasn't alone in it. He had his family, his community, and allies like Captain Shaw by his side. Together, they would keep moving forward, determined to create a future where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality for everyone. Hey everyone! If you found Alex's journey inspiring and want to stay updated with more powerful stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. We're sharing more stories that highlight resilience, justice, and real-life change. Let's keep the conversation going. Your support helps us bring these important narratives to life. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.